the shot that ended it all was fired, from a rooftop no one thought to cover. That was the part nobody talked about afterward. Not in the debrief, not in the after-action reports, not in the careful language of the official summary that described the Fallujah secondary operation as resolved through coordinated team effort. Nobody wanted to say out loud that the only reason any of them made it back was a 29-year-old woman from rural Montana who'd been on the team for 6 weeks, and whom most of them had never bothered to learn the name of. Her name was Sergeant Tess Rayne, and for most of that deployment she might as well have been invisible. Rayne had arrived at FOB Keller on a Tuesday, which was already a bad sign. Tuesdays were processing days when the logistics convoys came through and the base smelled like diesel and burned coffee, and the men were irritable from waiting. She came off the truck with her pack and her rifle case and a folder of transfer papers, and the first person to see her was Staff Sergeant Lou Beckett, who looked at her, looked at the rifle case, and then looked back at her as though she'd made a mistake. "You're the replacement?" he said. "Yes, Sergeant." Beckett had been running the sniper support element for 14 months. He was 37 years old and had the face of someone who had stopped being surprised by anything, except that apparently he hadn't, because he looked at Rayne for a long time without saying anything else. The replacement, not a question this time. More like he was saying it to himself. She'd gotten used to that particular silence. The silence that said, "I was expecting someone else." It followed her around like a second shadow. FOB Keller was home to a 12-man team running reconnaissance and interdiction operations across a stretch of territory that had been quiet for 8 months and was now, suddenly, not quiet. 3 incidents in the past 6 weeks. Weapons cache discovered and then mysteriously emptied before EOD could get there. An informant found dead in a drainage ditch outside Ramadi. And 2 weeks ago, a coalition convoy hit by an IED on a road that had been swept clean 4 hours prior. Someone had access, someone was watching, and somewhere in the puzzle of it, there was a shooter they hadn't found yet, someone patient and methodical and very, very good. Rayne had been sent because the team's previous sniper support, a specialist named Doherty, had taken shrapnel to the knee in the convoy attack. She had his bunk, his scope charts, and approximately 0 of the goodwill he'd built over the previous 8 months. The team lead was a captain named Orrin Slade. He was compact and dark-haired and operated with the controlled efficiency of someone who had learned very early that showing uncertainty in front of his people was a luxury he couldn't afford. He had a good reputation. He was fair. He kept his team alive. He also, in those first 2 weeks, looked through Rayne more often than he looked at her. It wasn't hostility, exactly. It was more like the absence of acknowledgement, which in some ways was worse. Hostility at least required a person to register your existence. What Slade did was simply fail to factor her in, the way you failed to factor in furniture. The briefings happened around her. The equipment checks happened around her. The running jokes and the shared shorthand of men who had spent more than a year in close quarters together, all of it, flowed around Rayne like water around a stone. Beckett was more direct about it. "Nothing against you personally," he told her the 3rd day, when she was zeroing her rifle on the range. He was watching her from 15 feet back, arms crossed, not offering to help. But Doherty was good. He was real good. And we had a rhythm. "You're going to have to earn your way into that." Rayne finished her adjustment, chambered around, and put the next 3 shots within a half inch of each other at 300 yards. Beckett looked at the target. He didn't say anything. "I know," she said. "I'm not Doherty." That was true. She wasn't. What she was something else entirely. But it would take a while for anyone to understand that. The other members of the team were what you'd expect from men who'd been living and working together in conditions of sustained stress and constant low-level danger. They had calcified into their roles. There was Corporal Jim Os, 24 years old and from Tulsa, who processed everything through a layer of deadpan humor that you had to watch closely to realize was covering for something genuine. There was Sergeant Derek Paul, the team's medic, who was quiet in the way that medics often got quiet after a while, like they'd used up all their words on the things they had to say in the field and didn't have any left for regular conversation. There was Sergeant First Class Emmett Craw, Slade's second-in-command, who had 11 years in and the kind of patience that didn't come from temperament, but from discipline, which was a different thing entirely. And there was Warrant Officer Gavin Dex. She recognized the name from the file and noted it was already on the list she'd been given, used in a previous rotation, but that was irrelevant now. Dex was the team's intelligence liaison, which meant he talked to people Rayne wasn't cleared to know about, and came back with information that was sometimes right and sometimes only partly right, and occasionally wrong, in ways that got dangerous. He was 32, tall, red-haired, and had the kind of confidence that came from being told he was the smartest person in the room often enough that he'd started to believe it. It was Dex who made the comment that circled back to her later. It was the second week, during a planning session she was attending but not really part of. She was there because Slade had included her on the distribution list, but no one had asked for her input, and she hadn't offered any. They were going over the map of the suspected weapons corridor, and Dex had a theory about the shooter, the one they were still looking for, the one who had possibly been responsible for the IED placement and the informant killing. He's working a pattern, Dex said, moving his finger along the map. Each incident is roughly 2 clicks from the last. He's establishing a range, testing response times. Professional, probably trained. My guess is external support, someone who came in specifically for this. Rayne looked at the map. She didn't say anything. What I can't figure, Dex continued, is how he's moving without being picked up. We have eyes on the main corridors. The agricultural roads are monitored. He's either using something we haven't flagged, or he's got cover we don't know about. Rayne looked at the map. She cleared her throat. 3 people looked up. Dex did not. There's a canal system, she said. Old irrigation. It's not on the current tactical maps because it was listed as non-functional in the '08 survey. But if you look at the soil moisture pattern in the satellite imagery from last month, some of those channels are still holding water, which means they're traversable at night. Silence. Slade looked at her for a full second before looking back at the map. Dex pulled the satellite image over and studied it. That's an agricultural survey interpretation, he said. Not really our lane. I grew up irrigating, Rayne said. The soil doesn't lie about where the water's been. Another silence, a different kind. I'll have the imagery reanalyzed, Slade said, in the tone he used when he was filing something away to think about later. Not dismissal exactly, but also not engagement. The analysis came back 4 days later and confirmed what she'd said. No one mentioned her name in the context of it. The operation that changed everything was called Ridgeline Quiet, which was a planning name that meant nothing. Because all planning names meant nothing, they were just words pulled from a random list so that the enemy couldn't decode intent from nomenclature. The actual operation was a nighttime interdiction of a suspected coordination site in a partially collapsed warehouse complex on the northern edge of a town called Qasim. Not on most maps, barely a dot on the ones it was on. A collection of maybe 800 people living around a water tower and a market and several generations of accumulated grievance. The intelligence on Qasim had been building for 3 weeks. Dex's sources said the warehouse complex was being used as a meeting point, possibly a transit hub for weapons moving through the canal system Rayne had flagged, possibly also the location of the external shooter. Slade's plan was straightforward. 3 elements: staggered approach, 2 blocking positions, and a direct entry team. Rayne was assigned to a support by fire position on a water tower 300 meters to the southeast. Single elevated position, Beckett told her during the prep briefing. You've got line of sight to the main entrance and the east wall. Anything tries to exit, you call it. Only engage if I authorize or if there's immediate threat to the entry team, understood. You'll be working solo. No spotter. She looked at him. Doherty works solo, he said, which wasn't an explanation, but was the only one she was going to get. She didn't argue. She'd worked solo before. She had, in fact, always preferred it. A spotter was a communication system, and she'd found over time that what she needed most in those moments wasn't communication. It was silence. It was the particular quality of attention that only came when there was nothing in your ear and no one beside you, and the whole world narrowed down to the distance between you and what you were watching. Her father had taught her that, not in those words, but in the way he taught everything, by example and silence, and the patient accumulation of hours in the field. He'd been a hunter, not a soldier, had grown up in the Bitterroot Valley and learned to read terrain the way other people learn to read text, as a system of meaning that rewarded attention and punished assumption. She thought about him sometimes, in the slow time before operations. She thought about the morning he'd taken her out before dawn to watch elk move through a meadow below the tree line, and how he hadn't said a word for 4 hours, and how by the end she'd understood that the silence was the lesson. That patience wasn't passive. That watching was a skill. that the land would tell you what it knew if you were willing to shut up long enough to hear it. Her father had been gone for 6 years now, but she still heard him in the stillness before the shot. Ridgeline quiet went wrong at the 11-minute mark. Slade's entry team was inside the warehouse complex, moving through the first corridor when the signal went down. Not degraded, down. Total loss of the team comms frequency, sudden and complete, which was either equipment failure or active jamming, and in either case, meant the three elements were now operating blind to each other. From her position on the water tower, Rayne still had line of sight. That was all she had. No radio, no way to coordinate, no way to know what was happening inside the walls. She couldn't see through. What she could see, the main entrance, the east wall, the narrow alley running north-south along the western face of the complex, and approximately 400 meters of open ground between the complex and the nearest cover to the south. What she saw. At minute 13, a man appeared in the alley. Then a second. They were moving with the deliberate care of people who had done this before, not running, steady, purposeful. The second man was carrying something Rayne's scope resolved into a rifle case. She watched. At minute 15, two more. Same alley, same direction. At minute 16, a fifth figure. This one on the roof of the adjacent building, moving into a prone position. Rayne keyed her radio. Nothing. The jamming was still active. She thought very clearly, without panic, which was something she had learned was not a natural state but an acquired one, built over years of practice and failure and the gradual erosion of the assumption that you could control what happened to you. All you could control was the quality of your attention. All you could control was what you did with what you saw. The figure on the roof was settling into position. The rifle case was open. She did the math. The roof position had line of sight back to the warehouse entrance. The men in the alley were at the edge of the open ground. If the entry team came out the main entrance, which they would, that was the exfil plan. They would exit into a kill zone that was already being set up. Rayne had been authorized to engage on immediate threat to the entry team. The threat was immediate. It was just not yet visible to anyone but her. She thought about calling it in. Then she thought about the fact that she had nothing to call it in on. She thought about Doherty and how Slade had built a team around trusting him. She thought about her father and how he had once told her that the difference between a hunter and a marksman was that a marksman shoots what they see, but a hunter understands what they're looking at. She took a breath and made a decision. The figure on the roof went still. Rayne adjusted for wind. The elevation changed between her position and the roof was 14 meters. The distance was 431 meters. She'd paced it out during the planning phase, which was something she did because her father had taught her that you didn't wait until you needed information to gather it. You gathered it when you had time and stored it against the moment you wouldn't. She held. She waited. The entry team's exfil was by plan, triggered by Slade's radio signal. The signal wasn't working, but the plan also had a time component. If comms went dark, the entry team would exfil at the 20-minute mark. Protocol. She was at minute 17. The shooter on the roof was moving his rifle toward the warehouse entrance. Rayne fired. She worked the bolt without looking away from the scope. The two men in the alley registered what had happened and broke in opposite directions. One toward the southern cover, one back toward the complex. The one moving south had the rifle case. She made her choice. The shot caught the rifle case, not the man. The case spun out of his hands and he stumbled, then ran. She let him run. The remaining men in the alley had gone to cover. She had their positions. She did not fire again, and the entry team was not yet in the open, and engaging without clear threat resolution was how you created chaos instead of managing it. At minute 20, the entry team came out the main entrance. Slade was first. He swept his weapon, registered no immediate contact, and began moving the team across the open ground. Rayne keyed her radio once, then again, still nothing. She fired a single round into the ground, 20 meters ahead of the entry team's direction of travel. Not at them, not close enough to endanger, but close enough to redirect. It was the signal she'd have used in training. She had no idea if Slade would recognize it. He stopped. He looked toward her position. He looked at the alley. He redirected the team. They moved north instead of south around the complex perimeter, away from the men still pinned in the alley, away from the dropped rifle case, away from the kill zone that had been set for them. The jamming ended at minute 23. The comms came back in a burst of static and overlapping voices. By the time coordination was reestablished, the entry team was at the northern exfil point, and Rayne was on the ground, moving toward the rally position with the specific controlled urgency of someone who has done a very difficult thing and is now focused entirely on what comes next. Beckett found her at the rally point. He stood there for a moment, looking at her. "The roof," he said. "Yes, and the redirect, signal round," she said. 40 meters, past the marker. I wasn't sure he'd read it. Beckett looked at her. In his face was something she hadn't seen before, from him or from any of them. Not gratitude, exactly. Not respect, exactly. Something more precise than either of those words. "Where did you learn the redirect signal?" he said. "Doherty's notes," she said. "He had a binder. I read it the first week." Something shifted in Beckett's expression. Not quite anything she had a name for. "The case," he said. "The rifle case. You could have taken the shot, I know. Why didn't you?" She thought about how to answer that. She thought about her father and the elk in the meadow and the 4 hours of silence that had taught her more than any classroom had. "He was going to run," she said. "I let him go because a live runner will lead you somewhere. A body just tells you where he was." Beckett nodded slowly, the way someone nods when they've just recalibrated something internal. The debrief was an hour later, in the command tent, with the full team and a representative from the intelligence element who had come up from the main base and who sat in the corner taking notes. Slade walked through it methodically, the way he walked through everything. Entry, timeline, comms loss, exfil. He was precise and unemotional in the way of someone who had processed the shock privately and was now operating on the professional level. When he reached the exfil timeline, he paused. At minute 20, he said, "We came out the main entrance into what would have been a coordinated ambush. 2 men in the western alley, 1 shooter on the adjacent roof with a scoped rifle, another man with a secondary weapon." He paused. None of them were operational. Sergeant Rayne had already addressed the roof position and redirected the rifle case before we exited. The tent was quiet. "The redirect signal," Slade said. "I want to be clear that I recognized it because of our prior training protocols, and that Sergeant Rayne adapted the signal under conditions of total comms blackout to communicate critical tactical information. That is not a small thing." He looked at her then. Not through her. At her. "The shooter's case was recovered," he said. "Forensics confirmed it. The rifle inside is a match to the weapon used in the convoy attack 6 weeks ago. We found him, not because of a surveillance net or a drone or intelligence analysis, but because Rayne let him run." More silence. Craw, Slade's second, was looking at the table. He cleared his throat. "I owe you an apology," he said. "It was addressed to no one and everyone, and specifically to Rayne. For the first 2 weeks. Rayne didn't say anything. She understood that he was giving her something, and that the right response was to receive it without comment. Dex had been quiet for the entire debrief. He was quiet now. After a moment, he said, "The canal system. You were right about that too." "I know," Rayne said. "It wasn't arrogance. It was just fact." She had known, and she had said so, and no one had followed up, and the analysis had confirmed it without attaching her name to it, and she had not made an issue of any of it because making an issue of it wasn't going to help her do her job. Hesp, from his corner, said she read Doherty's binder. A sound moved through the tent, not quite laughter, not quite release, something in between. Beckett looked at her across the table. "Doherty was good," he said. It was what he had told her at the beginning. He let it sit for a moment, and then he said, "He would have taken the shot." She understood what he meant. He wasn't criticizing Doherty. He was marking the difference. "Different lens," she said. "Same purpose." Beckett nodded. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Later that night, Rayne sat outside the command tent on an overturned crate and looked at the sky, which was the color of iron and very clear and full of stars that had nothing to do with any of this. Paul, the medic, came and sat near her. Not with her. Near her. The way medics did things, with attention to the quality of proximity. "You okay?" he asked. "Yes, I'm asking for real." She thought about it. "I'm okay," she said. "I'm good." He looked at the sky with her for a while. "Beckett said you're the best shot he's seen in 11 years. He said that? After the debrief. To Slade. I wasn't supposed to hear it. She was quiet. "What's it like?" Paul said. "To be that good at something and have no one see it." She turned that question over. She thought about her father. She thought about the meadow and the elk and the 4 hours of silence, and the fact that the elk had never known they were being observed, and that the observation had mattered anyway, had contained something, had been its own kind of completeness. "Lonely," she said finally. "And also not. Because you still know." Paul nodded like that made sense. Maybe it did. 2 days later, the runner they'd let go led them to a secondary site. 3 kilometers north, in a structure disguised as a grain storage facility. The site contained coordination materials, a communications relay, and confirmation of the external network they'd been tracking for 2 months. Slade filed the after action with her name in it, not as a footnote, not in the passive language of institutional credit distribution, front page, first paragraph. Operational success attributable in significant part to the field decision-making of Sergeant Tess Rayne, whose situational assessment under compromised communications conditions and whose deliberate the secondary target produced intelligence yield that months of conventional surveillance had not. She read it. Once over, she filed it away. She didn't think about it much after that. She thought about the next operation and what the terrain looked like and what the wind was doing in the valley to the north and how much she could learn before anyone needed her to have already learned it. That was what she did. That was who she was. The team came to understand that over the weeks that followed, not in a ceremony, not in a conversation, but in the slow accumulation of small moments. Hesp saving her a seat at briefings, Craw asking her read on terrain before making his own assessment, Slade including her name in planning discussions the way he included Beckett's, with the particular naturalness that meant he'd stopped thinking of her as a variable and started thinking of her as a given. Beckett never said what he'd said to Slade, the best shot in 11 years. He never said it to her face. But one morning, 3 weeks after Ridgeline Quiet, he handed her a scope chart, a new one, calibrated to the elevations in their current operational area, annotated in his handwriting. She looked at it. "For your kit," he said in the tone that meant he wasn't going to explain it further. She put it in her kit. It was the most direct thing he knew how to say.